During the revelation of Elbaf's Harley, we were told about the origins of the One Piece world, as even before the Void Century there existed a first world, and the shocking reveal is that this world seems identical to ours, with the same modern technology, even depictions of modern skyscrapers, opening up the potential groundbreaking revelation that the One Piece world might be our world. But is the One Piece world really a post-apocalyptic Earth? Or is Oda just simply creating a fantasy world that really just resembles it? You may be surprised at the tons of evidence across the series that suggests the two might actually be one and the same. So let's entertain the idea and break down everything that we know so far that could establish this one way or another, if the future of humanity really is that of One Piece. Now, before we get into anything, we need to make something very clear. It's not confirmed that the One Piece world is indeed the same Earth as ours. It just simply hasn't been officially stated in a way to say that for certainty. But at the same time, this isn't some wild theory either, as the way it is presented at least strongly implies the possibility that this is likely the case. So this is less about proving a theory and more understanding how much sense this implied possibility makes. So in the end, just keep in mind that none of this is confirmed for sure, so we're here more to explore the possibility of it and if it would make sense for this to be the case as supported by in-world evidence. This is going to get pretty real, quite literally, so brace yourself for it. At the very least, we know for a fact that the first world had a technologically advanced society, one with modern skyscrapers similar to ours. So the idea that Oda is going for could be one of two. Either one, this original first world was indeed our very own planet Earth, exactly as it is today, or two, this was a planet pretty much identical to Earth, but with some artistic liberties to differentiate it from ours, like slightly different topography and civilizations for the sake of artistic liberty. But at the very least, even if it's just a similar planet, the question would be just how similar is it to ours? And so because of that, I want to go through the series and point out all those small little details that didn't make originally as much sense, and we may just have been dismissed as narrative conveniences, but now have a canon reason for existing, as they may be remnants of what is our very own society of today. Let us begin by comparing the two worlds directly to each other. On the general surface, at least from a celestial level, something we've pointed out is how the One Piece world is pretty much identical to ours. Despite a lot of fan speculation on if the One Piece world is smaller or bigger than ours, it generally seems to be around the same size, particularly reinforced by the fact that it has an identical revolution to ours, having a Gregorian-like 365-day calendar of 24 hours each day, with even leap years still included. Furthermore, beyond that, what matters the most is what lies outside the world, being the almost identical solar system. Of course, there is the sun, but there's also the moon, which not only has the same name, but is built exactly identical to our moon as well. And for the solar system itself, it even seems like we have the same planets, because in One Piece, we have the concept of the 5 elder planets, which refers to the 5 planets closest to the Earth, since the 3 furthest planets, Uranus, Neptune or Poseidon in this case, and Pluton were too far away from the Earth to be properly viewed without a telescope, so they were only discovered in modern times, or at least until Pluton was demoted from being a planet. In a databook, the North Star is even mentioned as being located right above the North Pole, just like in our world. And this is supported by the orrery in the library of Ohara, one many mistake to be several different moons, despite the fact it's been stated clearly across the series that there's only one moon, while in reality they are almost certainly the 5 elder planets and the moon, making for a total of 6, which adds up. And if the names of the 5 elder planets are anything to go by, being Saturn, Mars, Mercury, Venus, and Jupiter, then this reinforces even more the idea that they are one and the same. Particularly, something that comes to mind is that according to Crocodile, the ancient weapon Pluton was named after a god, and the planet Pluton is indeed named after a god, Pluto or Hades, the god of the underworld in Greek mythology. With this added context, was he referring to some other god in the myth of One Piece, or could this actually be a surviving legend about the names of Greek gods passing on to the present? planet. After all, it's been implied that the ancient weapons preceded even the Void Century, potentially being made in the first world, as they were considered ancient even then and already knew about the reincarnation cycles of the likes of Poseidon's power. So if the weapons were created in our original first world, then it would make sense they were named after some Greek deity. And it would make sense that it was named after a planet that, in a world without technology, could simply not be spotted, and thus was only known in a more ancient world. When you think about it, the planet's older history lines up as well. The geological eras, the formation of the moon, and particularly the era of dinosaurs lining up with that in the world of One Piece. We are told that dinosaurs existed for hundreds of millions of years in the story by Queen, something that lines up with the period of dinosaurs in our world that eventually went extinct during a great extinction event. Now, there is one thing here that does make it different from our world, and it's the fact that dinosaurs survived in the world of One Piece, something that I think we can safely assume hasn't happened in our world. But to be fair, that's an assumption said from the present point of the story. What if at some point during the first world, some kind of Jurassic Park-like cloning was achieved, and that's how the dinosaurs were brought back? We can't really exclude that possibility, especially in a world with such technology, so I don't think this really contradicts anything, and really, it just further lines up the connections between the world being so similar to ours, geologically and historically. But here's a fundamental issue that comes with the planet. Even though in dimensions and conditions it is generally the same, the actual topography of the world is simply completely different. Now yes, we know already the shape of the world changed due to the Great Flood, so potentially if the Great Flood was removed, the land under would look like that of our world. Except the issue is, it simply doesn't. We already have a very good general idea of how the One Piece world looks like from Oda's notes, and the reality is that even if you were to lower the sea level somehow, the shape of the continents doesn't even line up. More simply, if you try flooding our world by 200 meters in a digital chart, or even way harder than that, the shapes that form simply don't even remotely match up with the mountaintops that make up the One Piece world, and in fact way more land than what currently remains in One Piece is left with a sinking of 200 meters by comparison. No matter how you cut it, the topography is different. This would directly suggest that the two planets are indeed different, except that there is one issue, and it's the fact we already have evidence that the One Piece world was terraformed to some extent, due to the existence of the Red Line. This is mentioned pretty vaguely, but the Harley mentions that the Half-Flame Serpent was unleashed by the Earth God, and both the Merle and Elbaf lore seem to suggest that this was likely the Red Line. Nami mentioned that the Red Line is an agglomeration of different islands stuck together, so some power to somehow terraform the world led to the creation of this continent, as it's literally just this puzzle piece of different pieces of land. And thus, it's totally possible that in the original First Calamity, the very continents of the world were moved and shifted around, resulting in the very bizarre world we currently have, with the large red line, the regular Grand Line with all its magnetic poles, and the different continents up until the Great Flood. So at the very least, it's totally possible that the world may have looked like ours that was eventually terraformed and scrambled around. If that is the case though, it would potentially explain the existence of the cultures of the One Piece world resembling ours so much. Obviously the real reason is Oda just taking inspiration from our world, but what if there's a legitimate canon logic reason behind this all? What if, for example, the Alabasta Kingdom was the portion of land that originally used to be Egypt, which after the First Calamity was greatly damaged like the rest of the world, but survived in some form? Now, there is a conflicting statement about this, which is one of the very few pre-Second World dates we have, being that the Alubarna Palace, the real seat of Alabasta, is said to carry a history of 4,000 years. But what the guard says is simply that the palace represents their 4,000-year history, not that the palace itself was built 4,000 years ago. The reality is that we also don't know when the First World was. I've already suggested the theory that it may have been in the year 0 of the Kainreki Sea Circle calendar, the current calendar in use in the One Piece world. That sets the current story about in the year 1524, while the Void Century was from the year 600 to the year 700. As such, the original end of the First World could have been in the year 0, marking a new calendar as the world was reborn to be used since, and having the ancient weapons reappear every 700 to 800 years. But that's still speculation, so we don't know for sure. But my point is that fundamentally it doesn't matter much if Alibarna carries 4,000 years of history of a settlement being there, because it could very well be possible that the civilization that became Alabasta could trace itself back to at least 4,000 years ago, such as being Egypt itself. Similarly, the Tree of Omniscience on O'Hara was stated to be 5,000 years old, potentially predating as far as the First World. But the reality is that our oldest tree is already almost 5,000 years old, likely what Oda based this date on, so it could easily be one of our old trees from the present already that simply mutated further. But if you think about it, it all could logically make sense. A civilization like that of Egypt persisted and its traditions carried over to the present story. Or a place like Spain survived in the civilization of Dressrosa, with many traditions and even architectonic styles being kept or rediscovered from the past to carry them into the present. Named cities that we have in Dressrosa like Sevio, Carta, and Balsa could be remnants of Sevilla, Cartagena, or Barcelona. Or small details such as the people of Dressrosa eating paella or dancing flamenco could be cultural remnants that have survived as they were passed orally across the generations. Their modern technology was lost after the first calamity and then again after the second, so it makes sense that these civilizations kept their more traditional aspects rather than being more modern like the day of today. And the same could be said, of course, of something like the Wano country, which would obviously be what remains of Japan. So in fact, what if Mount Fuji found in Wano is in fact the same Mount Fuji from our world, deformed and slightly different in shape due to the change of topography in the world, making it a lot thinner, but still the same Mount Fuji persisting across the generations. Of course, there's plenty of other places like that across the story, such as Water 7, which is clearly inspired by Italy. But beyond that cultural inspiration, there's something particular about this city, and it's the fact that it has a lot of local words and terminology that are straight up just current modern Italian. If you go across the city in the manga, you'll notice many signs that are written in Italian. Ristorante Felicità, Ristorante Canale, Panetteria Pane, Vocazione, and so on. While these are just nice nods by Oda, of course, they also pose the concept that the Italian language exists, or at least a trace of it, within the world of One Piece. So how about we delve into the concept of languages in the world of One Piece? This isn't as widely known of a fact, but in the One Piece world, there is one standardized language that is used by almost all people. And according to the Straw Hat Stories novel, this language is called Koyogo. This term roughly translates to official language or government instated language, and according to the novel, they explained that while this language was largely adopted, it was the celestial dragons that forced this language to be standardized on a global level, generally outlawing any other types of languages. However, other languages do canonically exist, but we've been told that they have been mostly wiped out by the celestial dragons. In the novel particularly, we hear the story of a little girl who was the victim of what seems to be a genocide tournament, where not only her culture but even her language was eradicated by celestial dragons. But here's the thing, Koyogo is literally just Japanese. I mean, yeah, duh, obviously One Piece is a manga written in Japanese, but still, it can make canon sense in this world. This also explains why the One Piece world likes using a lot of Roman writing and a lot of English words despite being mostly Japanese, because that's basically what modern day Japanese is, having largely adopted Romanized signs for the beauty of them, and a lot of English words due to the modernization of the language. But this could potentially explain in canon how the modern Koyogo came to be, fundamentally being the fact that after the first calamity, Japanese just became a widely spread language for some political reason or another, and once the founders of the world government were commonly using it, they eventually enforced it as the global tongue that everybody would be forced to speak, eradicating all other languages. But those languages still exist and remain in this world, in things like the signs of Water 7, or even in things like the attacks of the Straw Hats and many other characters. Robin using Cien Fleur or Sanji using French words with his attacks are likely remnants of those forgotten languages remaining in vocabulary in some form or another. Even though they have been wiped out, traces still remain. This explains why certain peculiar words or elements that shouldn't belong to the One Piece world are still found within it. For example, Sanji refers to his outfit on Egghead as an aloha shirt, or even in the latest chapter, Usopp mentions the myth of the Excalibur sword. In Bonnie's flashback, the game Jenga is mentioned. Zor in his attacks mentions the Indian deity Ashura, or the people of Wano like Odin also worshipped the Buddha himself, which, may I remind you, is a real person of our world. Other religious figures like Jesus Christ are not directly mentioned, probably because it's more sensitive to those religions compared to Japan's native Buddhism, where it's not really an issue to mention Buddha. But putting that aside, other historical figures are mentioned as well, like electricity in the One Piece world being calculated in volts, named after Alessandro Volta, as Enel shows in his attacks, or temperature being calculated in Celsius, named after Anders Celsius. The history of the world may have been largely wiped, but its words, etymologies, and ancient concepts have survived in some form or another. Again, where the line blurs between reality and just the inspiration for fantasy is hard to say. One final element that is quite peculiar though is the presence of races in the world of One Piece. Now, by all means, humans have the potential to evolve further, but generally such a level of evolution takes a far longer time than just 8,000 years or two. And if the One Piece world isn't that far in the future from our present time, then how could all these races appear? But again, like the dinosaurs, there's plenty of possibilities with advanced technology is involved. What if the races of the world did not originally exist through natural evolution, but were biologically developed through the discovery and understanding of the bloodline elements? In fact, this is supported by the Harley exclusively only showing humans in the first world, no other races, whereas the other two worlds definitely have a lot more different races. And with devil fruits already being a form for humanity to evolve further, what if a similar technology was employed to form the races but is a more permanent change? Even characters like Arlong have said many times that fishmen are just evolved humans, so what if they really actually are? So in the end, is the One Piece world ours or not? Again, there's nothing that we can say decisively for sure. Maybe it really was ours, or maybe it's just meant to look like ours for the sake of narrative references. We can speculate all day, but any detail that we point to, like real people being sighted, could just be attributed to Oda breaking the fourth wall for the sake of references. So until we get more information from the story itself, objectively, we cannot say for sure. But let's entertain the idea of how this could have happened. The Harley speaks of the development of the Mother Flame, so that's something that still hasn't happened to us yet, but we are on the road of it. So it's speaking of a not too far future. Even now, humans are trying to find completely renewable energies that can be infinitely generated just like the Mother Flame, so it may very well be a near future. A world where humanity has developed an advanced form of nuclear power, the Mother Flame, and with it achieved the pinnacle of technology, while also bringing great inequality. The gap widens between the ultra-rich billionaires in power and the working class to the point that they are treated almost like slaves. Keep in mind the Harley doesn't talk about slaves, but rather the enslaved, using an archaic term, reisin, which generally refers more to those in slave-like conditions than the word slave directly, so it could very well be referring to the working class workers being treated almost like slaves by those above with all the money. This all eventually escalates until the world is potentially maybe terraformed in some form, creating the Hellflame Serpent, the Red Line, while also scattering around and altering the form of continents and the civilizations on them. As a result of this, civilizations are not only scattered, but they also lose all their advanced technology in this calamity, reverting to a more primitive state. However, retaining parts of their own cultures, they rebuild while keeping those cultures alive in a neo form. For some reason, new races have developed across the world, but they just end up being persecuted by humans. Eventually, Japanese becomes one of the most dominant languages, and when it becomes widely adopted by the alliance of kings that would conspire against Joy Boy, they would eventually enforce it as the adopted global language, similar to how they also likely enforce the belly as a globally accepted currency. During the Void Century, that technology is reawakened, as are the weapons, and Fruits are created as advanced genetic weapons. But ultimately, the world is flooded by evil, and the technology is lost again, with the government obtaining a stranglehold on the world and the remaining scattered societies and what remains of them, leading to the story as we currently know it. But in this whole scheme, there is one figure we're ignoring, and that is the figure of the sun god Nika. Because we know that Nika appeared in the first world, but if he did, how exactly did someone like Nika appear appear in this world of ours? Well, we can only speculate, but my own speculation on the matter harkens back to the idea that I've reinforced several times, that the original Nika didn't really exist, or rather that he did exist, but as a fictional character. Now, all we're told in the Harley, keep in mind, and what Jarl explains, is that the sun god appeared in the first world, but that's as vaguely defined as it gets. How he did is unknown, and we've already had several characters in the story reinforce the idea that the original Nika wasn't real, never really existed. During the Void Century, we did have a Nika in the form of Joy Boy, but that was someone who became Nika by eating a mythical fruit, thus again suggesting that Nika was just a mythical figure, a fictional character. And so the idea that I've already talked about here many times, and I won't bore you too much with it, is that Nika may have been a comic book character, a cartoonish figure meant to make others laugh that stretches around like a rubber hose cartoon, because he's literally a cartoon superhero, the warrior of liberation, much like a similar One Piece cartoon superhero, Sora the warrior of the sea. Even if you still think that Nika is a real person, that's perfectly fine, you can still just excuse it with the fictional character being the mythified version of a real person that did once exist. But if Nika's laugh tale was indeed an actual comic book made in the first world, what would that make it? Well, what else but One Piece, the very manga we're reading right now. Now, as I've said before, obviously I'm not saying Oda is gonna make himself canon in the story or self-insert, but rather that he's trying to tell a parallel with his work, or even that of other mangaka like Toriyama that influenced him as a child. Maybe Nika can be compared thematically to Luffy, but in Oda's eyes, maybe he could have even been inspired by figures like Goku being his own version of Nika. I think that fundamentally Oda is trying to tell us the core fundamental theme that stories have a very real tangible power to change our world, and in that regard the story of Nika in the original first world impacting so much the enslaved, those suffering, to the point that it felt like it brought them salvation, could be a parallel to how a story like One Piece is saving us from our own suffering and struggles as well, and how much like Nika, Luffy is the shining ray of sunlight that brightens our lives by making us laugh and helping us become better people and learn to coexist with each other. I think fundamentally that's the real answer to this conundrum on if the One Piece world really is ours or not, because whether it exactly is planet Earth really isn't the point here. The real matter at hand is the thematical symbolism Oda is trying to use by paralleling the story of this world with that of our own world. The story of the Harley is very obviously a cautionary tale, a tale against the warming of our planet or the dangers of human war and discrimination at the widening gap between the ultra-rich and the enslaved. A tale shows us that we need to come together and work hand in hand to take care of our planet and ourselves. And similarly, the presence of a comic book character like Nika during this time could be a symbolism about this central theme of how impactful One Piece is in our lives, and the One Piece world being so similar to ours that it is a way for Oda to show us more clearly that his moral lessons he's trying to impart us apply to our very own lives right now. One Piece isn't just a work of fiction, but it's also a way of life to better understand our very own world. But then, let's assume, just hypothetically, that this whole theory with Nika being a comic book character is true. What happened then? In the first world, the figure of Nika became a source of inspiration, but eventually the world was terraformed and destroyed, and it was lost to time. However, the myth of Nika remained and began to be deified, treated like a deity, the sun god, and eventually during the Void Century, that myth became the Hito Hitonomi model Nika, with Nika becoming a symbol of salvation for the people of the world once and for all. But then, what happened to that original story? Well, perhaps it was retained. It was treasured and safe-kept as it embodied all the details that the people of the ancient kingdom stood by. A laugh tale that is meant to be silly and goofy, but also incredibly profound and emotional to the point that it simply makes you laugh. Could it possibly be then that in the end the laugh tale was all this time the great treasure that is the comic book known as One Piece?